High over Germany in the daylight, campaigns of 1943 and 1944, staggered combat boxes of B-17G flying fortresses cruised at high altitude. Each bomber carried 13 Browning M, 2 heavy machine guns of 50 caliber mounted in nose, dorsal, ventral, waist and tail positions. Every gun commanded a clear arc, and fields of fire overlapped so that any fighter closing to short range flew into a zone covered by multiple guns from several bombers at once. From the cockpit of a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, the formation ahead could look deceptively static until the first streams of tracers fused into a moving lattice of fire. German pilots came to use the same image that American crews used and spoke of these formations as flying porcupines. Far below, on the narrow roads of Italy and later northwest Europe, a different kind of porcupine moved on steel tracks and rubber tires. An American armored column of tanks, half-tracks and trucks nose to tail pushed forward under dusty summer skies or cold autumn rain. When German infantry and light armored vehicles rose from behind stone walls, hedgerows or tree lines to spring an ambush, the reaction came within seconds. Turret tops and ring mounts swung toward the threat, and pintle posts on half-tracks traversed with practiced speed. Multiple 50 caliber heavy barrel guns opened fire almost together. Armor-piercing and armor-piercing incendiary bullets left the muzzle at about 2,900 feet per second and retained enough energy at several hundred yards to penetrate many types of field cover and the thin side, plates of German half-tracks, as well as engine blocks and fuel tanks. Men who moments earlier believed themselves safely concealed behind solid cover saw masonry shatter and felt the heavy impact of fragments and bullets passing through their positions. What had looked like a perfect ambush dissolved in fire and smoke as burning vehicles blocked the road and surviving attackers broke contact under a hail they could neither match nor stop. To the German soldier crouched in a ditch, or the pilot rolling inverted above the bombers, the Browning M2 was never simply another machine gun. It delivered a distinct layer of fire heavier than any rifle-caliber weapon in their own arsenal, reaching farther than 7.92 millimetre bullets and striking with penetration that no standard German infantry weapon could. Approach. The Wehrmacht possessed excellent general-purpose machine guns and stepped quickly to 20 millimetre cannon for heavier tasks, but nothing in regular infantry service occupied the exact ground between. Belt-fed heavy machine guns in larger calibers existed mainly as aircraft and specialized weapons, and were not widely issued as ground guns to frontline infantry. As a result, every encounter with American forces in the air or on the ground carried the same additional hazard, a sudden storm of 50 caliber fire arriving from unexpected directions from vehicles that seemed to bristle with guns, from bomber formations that turned the sky itself into a killing ground. German fighter pilots felt the shift first and most sharply. In one moment, the bomber stream drifted ahead, apparently vulnerable. In the next orange, tracers seemed to thicken into a continuous flow that filled the space around the cockpit and hammered on armor, glass and airframe. Many who survived such attacks later described the experience in similar terms, emphasizing how suddenly the defensive fire built up and how little time there was to press an attack before being forced away. On the ground, the lesson arrived with equal clarity. An infantry section waiting beside an Italian road or Norman lane watched the lead Sherman halt turret traverse, and the long barrel of the 50 caliber on its cupola rise slightly. A short burst walked across the stone wall they had chosen as shelter and drove splinters and chips back into their faces. Seconds later, the half-tracks behind the tank added their own guns. The ambush ended almost as soon as it began. Wherever American columns moved or bombers flew, the same weapon waited in large numbers mounted high, loaded with armor-piercing ammunition, ready to answer any threat with concentrated heavy fire. German troops learned to recognize the sound of its deeper report, the long orange tracers, and the distinctive impact that meant cover might have failed. They learned respect the hard way, one costly encounter at a time. John Browning first turned his mind to a heavy-caliber machine gun in 1918. Tanks had changed the battlefield, and low-flying aircraft demanded bullets that could reach higher and strike harder. He took the proven recoil-operated system of his 30 caliber designs and scaled every dimension upward to accept a cartridge of half-inch diameter. The resulting round, 12.7 millimeters by 99 millimeters, entered United States service in 1921. After years of testing and refinement for sustained fire, the Browning machine gun caliber 50mm, 2 heavy barrel received formal adoption in 1933. The mechanism remained elegantly simple. Short recoil unlocked the bolt, a belt of disintegrating links fed fresh cartridges from the left, and the heavy barrel dissipated heat through air alone. Cyclic rate settled between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, according to the driving spring chosen. Muzzle velocity with standard ball ammunition reached roughly 2,910 feet per second. Effective range against troops in the open stretched to about 1,800 meters, and the bullet carried lethal energy beyond 7,000 meters. One specification dominated every other in the minds of those who later faced the weapon. Armor-piercing ammunition had to perforate completely a plate of face-hardened steel, 7/8 of an inch thick at 100 yards, and 3/4 of an inch thick at 547 yards. Those two numbers, 7/8 at 100, 3/4 at 547, translated directly into wrecked half-tracks, shattered engine covers, and stone walls that failed to protect. American doctrine seized on the possibilities at once. The M2 became the universal heavy machine gun anti-personnel across open fields, anti-vehicle against anything lightly armored, and anti-aircraft against dive bombers and strafing fighters. It stood on tripods in heavy weapons companies, it rode ring mounts on tanks, and half-tracks it guarded landing craft and destroyer decks, and it armed the wings and turrets of fighters and the noses and bellies of bombers. German forces organized firepower differently. The MG-34 and MG-42 in 7.92 millimetre caliber delivered devastating volume at close and medium range. For anything requiring more weight, the jump went straight to 20mm and 30mm automatic cannon. Belt-fed heavy machine guns in larger calibers existed mainly as aircraft and specialized weapons, and were not fielded as standard ground guns in large numbers. The consequence was stark. Wherever American units appeared, an extra belt of fire accompanied them, heavier, longer-ranged armor-piercing, and mounted in profusion. German soldiers and pilots discovered that the usual calculations of cover and closing distance no longer applied. The Browning M2 imposed its own cold arithmetic on every battlefield it entered. The M2 heavy barrel weighed 84 pounds without tripod or vehicle mount. Receiver and barrel extension were machined from solid forgings, and the bolt locked into the barrel extension through a breech lock piece, while an internal accelerator lever helped drive the mechanism and flung spent cases downward at high speed. Barrels could be changed by a trained crew when they overheated with headspace and timing set by gauge and wrench, and a single barrel in combat could endure thousands of rounds before accuracy fell outside tolerance. Ammunition for wartime service came in several common types: ball for practice and general use, armor-piercing with a hardened steel core, armor-piercing incendiary that combined penetration with an incendiary composition and tracer, that burned bright enough for gunners to follow the stream in flight. Every armor-piercing and armor-piercing incendiary round that left the factory was required to meet the same standard: complete perforation of 7/8 of an inch of face-hardened plate at 100 yards and 3/4 of an inch at 547 yards. Those figures were not advertising claims, but test requirements measured and recorded on U.S. firing ranges before the ammunition was accepted and shipped. On the ground, the gun sat on the M3 tripod for deliberate defense, or rode pintles and ring mounts that allowed rapid traverse in every direction. Tanks carried one on the commander's cupola, half-tracks mounted them on forward skate or ring mounts, and sometimes additional positions and soft-skinned trucks in threatened areas often carried a single .50 caliber on a post mount. All drew from the same belts, used the same basic sights, and shared the same ballistic characteristics. In aircraft, the lighter AN-M2 version shed roughly 20 pounds and gained electric or hydraulic charging when installed in powered turrets and remote mounts. 13 guns on a single B, 17G, in nose, dorsal, ventral, waist and tail positions, meant that in a box of 21 bombers, more than 200 heavy machine guns could be brought to bear, many of them able to aim at the same, attacking aircraft as it approached. The cones of fire from each gun overlapped and grew denser as range closed. American factories turned out nearly 2 million Browning 50 caliber machine guns of all variants between 1940 and 1945. By the middle of 1944, the weapon had become a standard feature of American forces. Tanks rolled off ships with the gun already mounted, replacement vehicles arrived with mountings ready for it, and every heavy bomber that left the production line carried multiple 50 caliber positions from nose to tail. German troops faced the result wherever they turned. A continuous lattice of heavy caliber fire surrounded American columns on the march, guarded supply dumps, ringed airfields, and filled the air around bomber streams. Effective range on area targets reached about 1,800 meters, combined with the ability to perforate 3/4 of an inch of hardened steel at 547 yards. That single hard set of numbers lay behind every wrecked half-track and every shattered ambush that fell under the fire of America's M2 50 caliber gun. German fighter pilots assigned to the defense of the Reich learned the new arithmetic in blood and burning aluminum. Early models of the B-17 carried around 10 to 11 heavy machine guns. The G-series standardized on 13, and combat box formations tightened until every bomber supported its neighbors with interlocking fire. Escort fighters with 6 or 8 wing-mounted AN/M, 2 guns each, began ranging far ahead of the formations in 1944. Attack profiles that once worked collapsed. 20mm cannon were most effective when hits were scored at a few hundred yards, if they were to cripple a heavy bomber reliably. The closer the fighter closed, the longer it lingered inside the converging cones of 50 caliber tracers. Gunners fired with calculated deflection, and streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged on cockpits, oil coolers, radiators, and supercharger intakes. One moment, the Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf pressed the attack. The next, coolant poured from ragged holes, and the engine seized. Lost tables told the story without emotion. Units that favored stern and beam attacks suffered casualties far above replacement rates. Survivors changed tactics quickly. Head-on passes at maximum speed reduced exposure to seconds. Rocket barrages from around 1,000 yards kept the porcupine at arm's length. Heavy cannon installations in twin-engine fighters appeared for the same reason, to inflict damage while spending as little time as possible inside the most lethal envelope of 50 caliber fire. Pilots who survived repeated sorties against the bomber streams later described the moment when the tracers seemed to merge into a glowing wall, and when that happened, the only choices were to roll away at once or accept that the attack might be their last. The Luftwaffe adapted because it had no choice. The 50 caliber Browning had redrawn the sky. German infantry waiting beside the roads of Sicily, then Italy, then France, discovered the same weapon at ground level and closer range. An American column approached Shermans in the lead half-tracks behind trucks trailing. Anti-tank teams and machine gun sections crouched behind stone walls or in drainage ditches, fingers on triggers, convinced that thin-skinned vehicles offered easy prey. The first Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck left its tube. Almost before the smoke cleared, cupola guns and pintle mounts answered. Long orange tracers reached out across several hundred yards and struck the wall, the ambushers sheltered behind. Stone dust exploded inward as bullets punched through masonry and packed earth that would have stopped rifle-caliber fire. Men who had believed themselves safe behind farm walls felt the heavy impact of 50 caliber rounds and fragments driving through their cover. Half-track crews learned the lesson quickly. The angled side plates of their armored personnel carriers, on the order of 8 millimeters thick, had been designed to stop standard rifle and machine gun bullets. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds from the Browning 50 caliber tore through those plates, damaged engines and radiators, and sent burning fragments into the crew compartment. Vehicles that had once felt secure against small arms fire were knocked out in moments by a gun mounted high on the turret of a tank or on the rear of a moving half-track. Infantry sections caught in the open watched covering fire arrive from directions they had not expected. A tank halted on the road could swing its 50 caliber toward a distant tree line and rake an entire position until branches and bodies fell together. Troops inside brick houses or wooden barns discovered that walls offered concealment but not reliable protection. Rounds entered through one side and exited through another, sending splinters, fragments, and ricochets through the interior. Orders began to change. Daylight movement near known American routes demanded greater dispersion and better camouflage. Night marches became the preferred method wherever the situation allowed. Forward observers and anti-tank teams were sighted as far from roads and likely firing positions as the terrain permitted to reduce the chance of being engaged by heavy machine gun fire. 3/4 of an inch of penetration at 547 yards, the same cold standard that ruled the sky, now ruled the roads as well. German doctrine had built its infantry firepower around a single brilliant concept, the general-purpose machine gun in rifle caliber. The MG-34, and later the MG-42, delivered around 1,200 rounds per minute from relatively lightweight barrels. Volume of fire dominated close combat. Bursts could suppress entire platoons at several hundred yards. When heavier effect was required, the next step rose sharply to 20mm and 30mm automatic cannon carried on half-tracks or towed behind trucks. Nothing occupied the middle ground. Heavier automatic weapons in 13mm and 15mm calibers existed in German service, primarily as aircraft guns and specialized armament, but they were not developed into standard belt-fed heavy machine guns for infantry and ground units in the way the Browning M2 was for the United States. The Wehrmacht marched to war and fought to the end without a ground-heavy machine gun comparable to the Browning M2. American industry faced no such dilemma. One cartridge, 12.7 by 99mm, served every branch. One basic design refined over 15 years accepted the same belts, whether mounted on a tripod in a muddy field, bolted to a tank turret in the desert, or hung in the wing of a fighter over Germany. Factories turned out guns and ammunition by the millions. Standardization meant every Sherman, every half-track, every landing craft, every heavy bomber carried the same weapon and drew from the same stockpile. The consequence was systemic. American forces projected a continuous envelope of heavy-caliber, armor-piercing fire wherever they moved or fought. Columns on narrow roads bristled with guns that could answer in any direction. Bomber formations filled the sky with overlapping cones that began at long range and tightened as attackers closed. Supply dumps and airfields ringed themselves with the same long-reaching threat. German soldiers and pilots faced rifle-caliber density when they closed cannon weight when they stood off, but always the 50-caliber layer in between. Effective range 1,800 meters with 3/4 of an inch penetration at 547 yards. That single sentence summarized the missing piece they could never replace. Before the great daylight battles of 1943, German staff officers and commanders entered the contest with confidence in their own weapons. The MG-42 ruled ground combat in their doctrine, and 20mm and 30mm cannon were expected to tear enemy bombers apart. Allied machine guns were often judged by German specialists as slower or less advanced, and few in Germany anticipated that a half-inch infantry weapon would change the balance. The balance changed anyway. In the air, stern and beam attacks that had once scattered formations now ended in fire and falling wreckage. Pilots who survived brought back similar reports. The 50-caliber guns could reach out to longer ranges, strike hard, and were carried in numbers no previous bomber force had fielded. Tactics shifted toward frontal passes and standoff rockets because older approaches generated unsustainable losses. On the ground, ambushes planned with care collapsed under streams of tracers that ignored many forms of light cover and light armor. Columns that had seemed vulnerable on paper now answered threats from several directions at once with heavy machine gun fire. Daylight movement close to American armored routes within the effective envelope of vehicle-mounted 50-caliber guns became a calculated risk that many German commanders tried to avoid whenever they could. By the winter of 1944, the pattern was clear. Luftwaffe orders stressed speed in the attack and minimum time spent near the bomber formations. Infantry directives in threatened sectors demanded greater dispersion, better camouflage, and more reliance on night marches. The Browning M2 had become one of the factors that pushed German forces to alter how they moved and fought under Allied firepower. It was not a matter of legend or propaganda. German soldiers and airmen learned to respect the weapon the way a man respects a cliff or a river, not for drama, but for the repeated certainty of what happened when it was ignored. The same heavy bullet, the same long reach, the same penetration against light armor, and cover the same appearance on tanks, half-tracks, landing craft fighters and bombers. These were concrete characteristics, counted in burning, aircraft and shattered vehicles in plans abandoned and attacks broken off. The M2 entered service in 1933. It left the Second World War with a reputation earned one cold, precise burst at a time. Those who faced it carried home the same lesson. American industry had placed a distinct layer of firepower between rifle caliber and cannon, and in the German infantry and ground-heavy machine gun infantry, there was no direct counterpart to match it. The porcupine flew on. The porcupine rolled forward on steel tracks. German troops watched both and learned to step carefully around the quills.